Welcome to Reddit Aliens. Mariners of Reddit, what is the strangest thing you've seen out on the open ocean? Serious. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. We were at least 5 days away from land, and our ship was covered bow to stern in praying mantis. Not truly the weirdest thing ever, but after not seeing much life for a few weeks, it was an experience for sure. I've only spent about 2 months on the water, with about 2 weeks on the Great Lakes, but even just a couple miles offshore in the Atlantic, when it's a foggy and calm night, I totally get what sailors talk about when they say, sailing off the edge. Sometimes it looks like the water just stops, and there's nothing after it. An owl, 300 miles offshore. I hoped it would stay with us or get close enough to catch, but it flew off into the open water. Lots of land birds get stuck at sea. Sometimes they accidentally fall asleep on a ship and wake up in the middle of the ocean and try to find land again. Some get blown out from storms. They eventually drink too much salt water and die. The smaller ones get eaten by seagulls. It's sad. Solo night watch on a sailboat delivery. New moon with overcast skies. The strangeness wasn't what I could see, but rather what I couldn't. Total silence on a broad reach. Surfing down long, unbroken swells. No light in the sky, almost no perceived movement, just 4 hours of nothingness. Occasionally a wavelet would crest and reflect the light of the navigation light and cast a pale green flash. That was the only reminder that I was on the ocean and not cast into an endless void. It was the most unsettling experience I've ever had. One time on the coast I saw a massive storm stretching as far as you could see, which is of course very far when you have nothing obstructing your view. There was lightning everywhere I can put it into words. Every city was probably getting a lightning strike per minute, but from my point of view, with the massive panoramic view, there must have been 10 bolts of lightning per second, sustained over at least an hour. Absolutely mesmerizing. Like any good mariner, I grabbed my cigarettes and did the old 1 foot on the railing and watched. I live in Michigan, and we have the Great Lakes. These lakes contain huge shipwrecks and fish so big that people can't believe they aren't from the ocean. Lake Michigan freezes in the winter near the beach to where people can climb the ice, but it freezes in weird ways. It looks like giant frozen waves and small ice caves. Sometimes ice spheres form as the winter starts and thousands of ice balls just wash up on the beach. There are countless real horror stories and just as many ghost stories about the lakes. The strangest thing I've personally seen, I believe, is that giant ice wave effect and people swimming in freezing temperatures. I've seen massive ships visit from the ocean that make you sit there in awe at how deep these lakes must be for those to function here. Many people die and go missing in Lake Michigan every year. There are unpredictable currents that can pull people under, and most people here are taught how to best deal with these situations, but it can still pull you out into extremely deep waters where it is likely you cannot get enough energy to make it back to shore. If I had met the person who's the subject of this next post, I would want to take a picture with him, I would want to know his life story, I'd want to be his friend. Sounds awesome. Was motoring through Hurricane Irene, captaining a 32-foot charter catamaran between Angada and Joost van Dyke in open water many miles from any coast or harbor, and stumbled upon a local man with no boat doing deep-sea spearfishing. Dude had a 4x1.5 foot Rubbermaid container attached to 2 buoys filled to the brim with ice and fish, probably at least 300 pounds of deep-sea catches before gutting. And all he had was a rudimentary blacksmith iron spear rigged with silicone tubing on a stick for the propulsion. Why the F are you spearfishing in the open ocean during a hurricane, and how the F did you spear all those, you wizard? We scooped him up, gave him a ride, and then enjoyed an enormous bounty of fresh, deep-sea fish with the fellow. He must have given us 20 to 25 pounds of his catch when we scooped him and gave him a ride to Joost van Dyke. Saw the dude later on, getting off his dinghy at Pusser's Bar with plenty of fish catches for the tourists. Dude was chill, poured us some of his homebrew rum and open-fire grilled us some local chicken. Was bomb AF. Never learned his name. That sounds awesome. My dad and I used to go boating in the Gulf of Mexico to go fishing. We were way out when my dad caught a rope. He pulled it for seemingly ever until we found a wooden box on one end. The box was a trap filled with stone crabs, normal enough, but we couldn't find another end of the rope. The trap was very warm, and the crab seemed to be newly caught. Weird. I was relieving the midwatch one night. He had to be 0% illumination. I couldn't even see my own hands. There were no contacts either, except for what was off-going, watch described as a glow on the horizon dead ahead. Radar and AIS showed nothing along the ship's track, so I assumed it must be some astronomical or meteorological effect. As the watch progressed, the glow on the horizon would not go away. I double-checked the charts to make sure I wasn't driving right at some landmass, but we were still definitely in open ocean. Still nothing on radar and AIS. And to make matters worse, the glow was growing brighter and wider, now straddling our track at about 10 nm on either side. Then, AIS started lighting up. First it was one contact emerging about 15 nautical miles off the bow, then it was 2, then 4. Finally, the glow on the horizon turned into many distinct lights, soon stretching all across the horizon. Was an innumerable number of incredibly bright lights. The lights belonged to tiny fishing vessels that use lamps with the power of the small sun to attract squid to their position. The sheer number of fishing boats and their mini-suns illuminating the bridge to a point where I could see the stunned faces of everyone else on the bridge. It was insane to me how this fleet of rinky-dink fishing boats managed to get out of the middle of the ocean and how they were a way to light up the night like a rock concert. They had to be visible from over 30 nautical miles out. Anyways, the fishing boats turned into more of a nuisance than anything else, as they were a pain to maneuver around. Worse, some asshole fishermen kept shooting laser pointers at our pilot house. Physically seeing a ship and confirming it on radio, talking to the captain, then 10 seconds later, looking up and it's gone. Do a radio check and nobody knows the call sign or what ship I allegedly talked to. Also, we got caught on the edge of a tropical storm, and I was observing it with binoculars while my uncle and grandfather dropped the last crab cages. Water tornadoes, sea devils, are effing scary. I've spent about a full year in total at sea. Never have seen anything strange, as in something I couldn't explain. Probably the strangest experience was the one time, only once ever, that I was on a fishing boat and the skipper just turned the engine off for the night. We just drifted. While 2 guys slept and 1 stayed on watch. The silence and the sound of the waves on the boat, it was peaceful, yet disconcerting. In Slovenia, whilst on our research vessel, we saw a pale and bold thing almost emerge from the sea. It looked incredibly humanoid, as in its head was poking above sea level with a thin layer of water over its head. It was there for a split second, and we assumed it was a diver trying to scare us. Lo and behold, we carried out a biodiversity assessment in that very area and found nothing apart from some smaller fish, but no man. To this day, me and my marine biology professors have no idea what it was and how it got there. I was majoring in marine biology at the time. We named the species a Baldus manius. This next story reminds me of a feeling I had in the same situation. Have you ever been out to sea and not seen land as far as the eye can see? Father used to sail yachts for rich kids across the Atlantic so they could have it in their Mediterranean and Florida houses depending on the time of year. His first time, he got to truly see an open, unmolested starry night and says he was appalled that it was so unusual to him, and because we're all living in cities, everybody's missing out on that kind of natural beauty that almost every other human in history would have had access to. You'll get flying fish occasionally land on the deck of the ship and flop around a bit until they die. When I was very young and green cadet on a tanker in the Gulf of Mexico, our bosun grabbed one of the alive ones off the deck, looked at me and said, "Flying fish are good luck," then proceeded to bite the fish's head clean off and spit the head overboard, all while maintaining eye contact and casually spitting out the scales like they were sunflower seeds. Worth mentioning that this man was the largest man I'd ever met to that point in my short life. Picture Terry Crews, but not as lean, and with a Cape Verde accent. Probably the saltiest, strangest thing I'll ever see, but I'm constantly surprised by nature. Well, not the strangest, but probably the scariest. My grandfather was working in the Soviet fleet when they tested nukes. He was there when Tsar Bomba exploded too. He says that there were violent waves and everything was shaking. They didn't see the nuclear explosion, but the consequences were horrific. I may ask him for more of his army stories because he's quite old right now. He's 80. Definitely inquire. Back in the 1980s, I was sailing around the Philippines and I was becalmed one morning about 10 a.m. There was no land in sight. The water was as flat as a mirror. Within half an hour, everything turned yellow. The sky, the sea, possibly a reflection of the sky. I couldn't see where the horizon was. There was no funny smell, no wind. I couldn't see the sun, nothing, just yellow. It really weirded me out. It stayed like this for about an hour and then just sort of slowly dissipated. I thought it might have been a sandstorm, but there was no sand on the boat or on the water. It wasn't fog either. It was around 1989 or 90. I was out on the water off the coast of Florida, anchored with a bunch of other boaters who were all waiting around to see a fireworks display. We were on a fairly small speedboat, and the kids were getting bored and tearing around. My youngest son was standing on the back deck, feet in the water, when I heard him yell, "Look, Dad, dolphins!" It wasn't dolphins, it was sharks, lots of them. They aren't new to me, but I'd never seen so many fins at one given time in the ocean. I don't know if it was just the mass of boats or noise that drew them, or if someone in the group was chumming and intentionally drawing them over. I remember thinking they looked like great whites, but it was dark, and there were plenty of other sharks in those waters. Went on a trip from Hull to the Netherlands on a fat yacht several years ago. I was doing the sailing, not being sailed. I'm not a Ponce, DW. Of course, the North Sea is known for its oil or gas. What I found strange and almost creepy was the sheer amount of mostly abandoned oil rigs just scattered about, some relatively close together as well. I remember being able to see roughly 13 of them around us at one point. I worked on a research vessel. We once trawled up a prosthetic leg and a few days off land. I always wondered what happened to the person who that leg belonged to. Did they lose it overboard while fishing? Were they also attached to the leg in the water at some point? Probably. The mystery of the leg still sticks with me 5 years later. Been at sea for 3 years now. In the South China Sea, I saw some lights closing in and couldn't see anything on the radar. I was about to have a heart attack because those lights were closing in really, really fast. I went onto the bridge wing where I could take a 30-meter jump into the water as I was certain we were about to collide with some huge piece of I don't know what with lights. It was when it flew barely 1 meter off the bridge, I realized it was an aircraft with a really strange shape, maybe a drone? I really don't know. I still don't know why it was flying so close to the water. Wow, I might win this one. I was doing drug patrolling operations and some smugglers had tried to sink their boat when we showed up, but it had too many bales of cocaine to sink. We arrested the smugglers and then shot the boat, but the bullets would only penetrate a few feet into the bales. This thing wouldn't sink. A bunch of whales were curious about what was going on, so we stopped shooting at the boat because we didn't want to harm them at all. We rammed the boat at slow speed with our ship, and it broke in half and sunk, except for the bales of cocaine, which have bullet holes in them, and now the whales are playing with them. And I had to go down in a boat and get the bales of cocaine away from the whales, who were now enjoying themselves a lot more than they were a couple hours ago. This was a long day. TLDR, whales on cocaine.
So what would you make of this next story? Weather phenomenon or something supernatural?
I was on holiday and fishing with my girlfriend in a little rowing boat that we had rented with a motor in a remote area on a fjord in Norway. We were about 400 meters offshore when a fog started to develop around us. After a few minutes, it was so thick we could only see a few meters around us. The water had become mirror flat, and it was so quiet I could almost hear my heart beating. We sat on the boat and talked about how strange it was and snapped a couple of selfies before firing up the motor to try to slowly navigate out of the fog. My girlfriend was getting a bit scared at this point, and so was I. Even though the boat engine was on and in gear, the boat wasn't moving. I tilted the engine slightly up and saw that the propeller indeed spinning, so I lowered it again and I gave it some gas. We still weren't moving. Girlfriend dropped a piece of paper in the water and I gave it more gas. Nothing. We just weren't moving. The water was dead still. The fog almost seemed to pulse around us, and it was eerily silent. Girlfriend started to bawl, and I was freaking out when suddenly it felt like a giant foot kicked at the back of the boat, shoving us forward. The boat surged out of the fog back into the fjord, and the fog dissipated behind us in a matter of a few seconds. The propeller had taken hold of what headed back to the dock. Now, this was odd, but not as odd as what awaited us when we got back to the hut we had rented. The owner of the boat was waiting for us and said he was taking the boat back immediately because of some booking problems. He gave us back twice the money we had rented it for, and then said he had to leave, so we headed back to the boat together to get our stuff. As we were walking, my girlfriend mentioned the fog. He said, "Yes, we know about it." We pushed him further on the subject, but he got a bit angry and said, "Just get your things." It was bizarre. Back at the hut, we noticed the selfies we had taken were just white. There was zero EXIF data on them, and both phones, and oddly, both of our phones were 100% charged. This in itself was odd, as it was mid-afternoon and my S7 usually had about 40% remaining because of battery degradation. Anyway, that's my weird experience. 2 for me. 2008, in the Atlantic, a wall. Our deck was 60 feet off the water, and the wall was easily 30 feet off the water. It came from nowhere, not on a chart, not on anything. We saw it on radar and approached slowly to inspect. Not sure whatever came of as we went back to doing gator squares, waiting to refuel. Easily 30 feet high and miles long. 2010 Atlantic, fog. Endless dog that laid down on the ship while in transit. It was so thick you would get soaking wet from it on the smoke deck. Couldn't see outside more than 5 feet. The blowers in the engine room sent inside, and we had to turn them off. I went to a mooring station to look out, and it suddenly disappeared. We just drove out of it into a perfectly clear sky, not a cloud all the way to the horizon. I was working on a small cruise ship that had been chartered by a group of about 600 members of Titanic Appreciation Group. Some were fans of the film, some were history buffs, etc. The voyage was to commemorate, not recreate, the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. We sailed from New York City, stopped in Halifax, and then sailed a few days out to the site of the disaster. While on board, there were historical talks, group events, etc., and on the evening of the actual 100th anniversary, a lot of people dressed in period costumes, and they had hired a band with authentic musical instruments from that era to play and finish that last song. It was all pretty surreal, made more so by the relatively calm water and moonlit sky, and by knowing that the actual Titanic was lying directly below us on the sea floor. The strange part was that during the night, they had a priest gather at the railing of the open deck to say a prayer and toss a wreath into the sea. At the moment he did this, a single ordinary bird, a sparrow or similar, came out of nowhere and landed on the deck by my feet. This was over 400 miles, 640 kilometers from the nearest land, and we'd been at sea for a few days. It was a bit startling, even though I'm logically convinced the bird had just been on board with us since our last port. The stranger part was that the bird didn't seem sick or injured, but also wasn't afraid of me and allowed me to pick it up. I had to keep it in my cabin and feed it for a few days until we got back to land. When we did, I took it up to the deck where I'd found it and released it back out to fly away.